我也先解释一下他的背景。他在建筑师事务所上班，可是他主要的工作可能不是做设计，虽然他也做了一些设计，他主要的工作是学者。那么他在很多很好的学校在教书，他也在学校带 studio。那么他主要的这个重要的专长呢，就是像我刚刚解释的，从人类的这个人类史上的这个都市跟食物中间的互相的影响去做研究。那么请看一下他跟大家分享的。
How do you feed a city? It's one of the great questions of our time, yet it's one that's rarely asked. We take it for granted that if we go into a shop or a restaurant, or indeed into this theatre foyer in about an hour's time, there's going to be food there waiting for us, having magically come from somewhere. But when you think that every day for a city the size of London, enough food has to be produced, transported, bought and sold, cooked, eaten, disposed of, and that something similar has to happen every day for every city on Earth, it's remarkable that cities get fed at all. We live in places like this as if they're the most natural things in the world, forgetting that because we're animals and that we need to eat, we're actually as dependent on the natural world as our ancient ancestors were. And as more of us move into cities, more of that natural world is being transformed into extraordinary landscapes like the one behind me, a soybean field in Mato Grosso in Brazil, in order to feed us. These are extraordinary landscapes, but few of us ever get to see them. And increasingly, these landscapes are not just feeding us either. As more of us move into cities, more of us are eating meat, so that a third of the annual grain crop globally now gets fed to animals rather than to us human animals.
这句话是一个提醒，他的意思就是说，全世界现在在那种庞大的农场生产的农产品，有1/3并不是为了要给人类吃，而是要给家畜吃的。那就是说，它是要未来这个养肉，然后人去吃它的肉。那你看一下它的数据。
And given that it takes 3 times as much grain, actually 10 times as much grain, to feed a human if it's passed through an animal first, that's not a very efficient way of feeding us.
也就是说，如果直接拿那些谷物来喂人，跟拿去喂动物，再拿它的肉来喂人，是10倍。所以它并不是一件非常划得来的事情。这也就是上一堂课我们在讲的那个事。
And it's an escalating problem too. By 2050, it's estimated that twice the number of us are going to be living in cities, and it's also estimated that there's going to be twice as much meat and dairy consumed. So meat and urbanism are rising hand in hand, and that's going to pose an enormous problem. 6 billion hungry carnivores to feed by 2050. That's a big problem, and actually, if we carry on as we are, it's a problem we're very unlikely to be able to solve.
60亿的人口到2050的时候，其实已经不止60亿了。照我们前几堂课的分析，看起来它大概到75亿。那75亿人口，如果我们照现在的这个饮食文化继续下去的时候，那时候的地球基本是喂不饱人的。所以现在这个问题叫做，如果我们不改变，这个就无解。
19 million hectares of rainforest are lost every year to create new arable land, although at the same time we're losing an equivalent amount of existing arable to salinization and erosion. We're very hungry for fossil fuels too. It takes about 10 calories to produce every calorie of food that we consume.
这句话也是很重要，因为他说得很快。Every calorie of food take 10 to produce， 意思就是说，我们要吃进去的食物，如果要提供给我们10卡路里的食物，它事实上是我们拿了石油做燃料，烧掉10个卡路里，产生 就是烧掉10个卡路里产生1个卡路里给我们，所以是怎么算怎么划不来。那这个生产的方法从哪里来？西方，因为东方以前不是这样做食物的，所以他才会说这个文化需要去把它改变掉。
And even though there's food that we're producing at great cost, we don't actually value it. Half the food produced in the USA is currently thrown away. And to end all of this,
美国的食物制造出来的一半是丢掉了，那各位想想，台湾制造出来食物多少丢掉了？你自己吃不完的丢掉了，大概也不算少嘛，哈。
At the end of this long process, we're not even managing to feed the planet properly. 1 billion of us are obese, while a further billion starve. None of it makes very much sense. And when you think that 80% of global trade in food now is controlled by just 5 multinational corporations, it's a grim picture.
所有的这些大型的食物的交易，全世界只有5个公司在做，所以80%的食物是这5个公司控制。
As we're moving into cities, the world is also embracing a Western diet. And if we look to the future, it's an unsustainable diet. So, how did we get here? And more importantly, what are we going to do about it? Well, to answer the slightly easier question first, about 10,000 years ago, I would say, is the beginning of this process. In the ancient Near East, known as the Fertile Crescent, because as you can see, it was crescent-shaped and it was also fertile. And it was here about 10,000 years ago that 2 extraordinary inventions, agriculture and urbanism, happened roughly in the same place and at the same time. And this is no accident because agriculture and cities are bound together. They need each other.
这一句话也请各位记住，他讲说，大概在1万年前，在就现在伊拉克的那个地方，他开始了这个2个大的发明，一个叫做城市，一个叫农业。那为什么这2个东西是同时会被人类发明出来呢？因为这2个是城市就是要很多人来住，很多人来住就是要吃很多东西，所以农业跟城市本来就会连在一起做的。那这也就是等一下在这一堂课的比较后面一点的时候，我们会谈到未来的城市跟农业之间的关系跟设计的关系是什么。这个我们待会儿会花点时间来谈。
Because it was the discovery of grain by our ancient ancestors for the first time produced a food source that was large enough and stable enough to support permanent settlements. And if we look at what those settlements were like, we see they were compact, they were surrounded by productive farmland and dominated by large temple complexes like this one at Ur, that were in fact effectively spiritualized central food distribution centers, because it was the temples that organized the harvest, gathered in the grain, offered it to the gods, and then offered the grain that the gods didn't eat back to the people. So if you like, the whole spiritual and physical life of these cities was dominated by the grain and the harvest that sustained them. And in fact, that's true of every ancient city. But of course, not all of them were that small. Famously, Rome had about 1 million citizens by the 1st century AD. So how did a city like this feed itself? The answer is what I call ancient food miles.
这张图各位也许不熟悉，不过各位也应该把它记住，就是在这个罗马建造的一个城市，在西元1世纪，也就是差不多在我们所知道的这个基督教兴起的时候的故事。那个时候的罗马，它为什么有那么多食物可以喂饱它的100万人？因为它靠的所有都是海路。那个时候的陆路是不太能动的，陆路如果交通不便，那个食物就会烂掉，所以都是从海路过来。那罗马刚好在地中海的这个地方，所以它可以从非洲，可以从欧洲的其他地方把食物送过来，所以它才要去把它的版图扩张到那么大。
Basically, Rome had access to the sea, which made it possible for it to import food from a very long way away. This is the only way it was possible to do this in the ancient world, because it was very difficult to transport food over roads, which were rough, and the food obviously went off very quickly. So Rome effectively waged war on places like Carthage and Egypt just to get its paws on their grain reserves. And in fact, you could say that the expansion of the empire was really a sort of one long drawn-out militarized shopping spree, really. In fact, I love the fact, I just have to mention this, that Rome, in fact, used to import oysters from London at one stage. I think that's extraordinary. Anyway, so Rome shaped its hinterland through its appetite. But the interesting thing is, the other thing also happened in the pre-industrial world. If we look at a map of London in the 17th century, we can see that it's grain, which is coming in from the Thames along the bottom of this map. So the grain markets were to the south of the city, and then the roads leading up from them to Cheapside, which was the main market, were also grain markets. And if you look at the name of one of those streets, Bread Street, you can tell what was going on there 300 years ago. And the same, of course, is true for fish. Fish was, of course, coming in by river as well. Same thing. And, of course, Billingsgate famously was London's fish market, operating on-site here until the mid-1980s, which is extraordinary, really, when you think about it. Everybody else was wandering around with mobile phones, you know, that looked like bricks, and then the sort of smelly fish happening sort of down on the port. And this is another thing about food in cities. Once its roots into the city are established, they very rarely move. Meat is a very different story because, of course, animals could walk into the city. So much of London's meat was coming from the northwest, from Scotland and Wales. So it was coming in and arriving at the city at the northwest, which is why Smithfield, London.
如果要对伦敦有认识，就是说，骨料跟鱼类都是从泰晤士河从这些码头上来，所以从这边上来到这边的市场来卖。 动物从这边来，家禽从这边来，所以是这样子集中在这一带。
London's very famous meat market was located up there. Poultry was coming in from East Anglia and so on to the northeast. I feel a bit like a weather woman doing this. Anyway, and so the birds were coming in with their feet protected with little canvas shoes. And then when they hit the eastern end of Cheapside, that's where they were sold, which is why it's called poultry. And in fact, if you look at the map of any city built before the industrial age, you can trace food coming into it. You can actually see how it was physically shaped by food, both by reading the names of the streets, which give you a lot of clues. Friday Street on the previous slide was where you went to buy your fish on a Friday. But also, you have to imagine it full of food, because the streets and the public spaces were the only places where food was bought and sold. And if we look at an image of Smithfield in 1830, you can see that it would have been very difficult to live in a city like this and be unaware of where your food came from. In fact, if you were having Sunday lunch, the chances were it was mooing or bleating outside your window about 3 days earlier. So this was obviously an organic city, part of an organic cycle. And then 10 years later, everything changed. This is an image of the Great Western in 1840, and as you can see, some of the earliest train passengers were pigs and sheep. So all of a sudden, these animals are no longer walking into market. They're being slaughtered out of sight and mind, somewhere in the countryside, and they're coming into the city by rail. And this changes everything. To start off with, it makes it possible for the first time to grow cities, really any size and shape in any place. Cities used to be constrained by geography. They used to have to get their food through very difficult physical means. All of a sudden, they're effectively emancipated from geography.
他这一段的意思是说，城市本来都是不是要靠近像罗马一样靠近海边，就是要像伦敦一样靠近河边，交通要很方便。可是自从有火车之后，这些交通就变成被解放了。所以你在任何一个地方都说，我只要有火车过来，我就可以建立一个城市。所以它变成城市的这个跟食物的关系改变，那就改变了整个城市的设计。
And as you can see from these maps of London in the 90 years after the trains came, it goes from being a little blob that it was quite easy to feed by animals coming in on foot and so on, to a large splurge that it'd be very, very difficult to feed with anybody on foot, either animals or people. And of course, that was just the beginning. After the trains came cars. And really, this marks the end of this process. It's the final emancipation of the city from any apparent relationship with nature at all. And this is a kind of city that's devoid of smell, devoid of mess, certainly devoid of people, because nobody would have dreamt of walking in such a landscape. In fact, what they did to get food was they got in their cars, drove to a box somewhere on the outskirts, came back with a week's worth of shopping, and wondered what on earth to do with it. And this really is the moment when our relationship, both with food and cities, changes completely. Here we have food that used to be the centre of the social core of the city at the periphery. It used to be a social event, buying and selling food. Now it's anonymous. We used to cook. Now we just add water or, a little bit of an egg if you're making a cake or something. We don't smell food to see if it's okay to eat. We just read the back of a label on a packet. And we don't value food. We don't trust it. So instead of trusting it, we fear it. And instead of valuing it, we throw it away. One of the great ironies of modern food systems is that they've made the very thing they promised to make easier much harder. By making it possible to build cities anywhere and any place, they've actually distanced us from our most important relationship, which is that of us and nature. And also they've made us dependent on systems that only they can deliver, that, as we've seen, are unsustainable. So what are we going to do about that? It's not a new question. 500 years ago, it's what Thomas More was asking himself. This is the frontispiece of his book Utopia, and it was a series of semi-independent city-states, if that sounds remotely familiar. A day's walk from one another where everyone was basically farming mad and grew vegetables in their back gardens and ate communal meals together and so on. And I think you could argue that food is a fundamental ordering principle of utopia, even though More never framed it that way. And here's another very famous utopian vision, that of Ebenezer Howard, the Garden City. Same idea, series of semi-independent city-states, little blobs of metropolitan stuff with arable land around, joined to one another by railway. And again, food could be said to be the ordering principle of his vision. It even got built, but nothing to do with this vision that Howard had. And that is the problem with these utopian ideas, that they are utopian. Utopia was actually a word that Thomas More used deliberately. It was a kind of joke, because it's got a double derivation from the Greek. It can either mean a good place or no place, because it's ideal, it's an imaginary thing. We can't have it. And I think, as a conceptual tool for thinking about the very deep problem of human dwelling, that makes it not much use. So I've come up with an alternative, which is Sitopia, from the ancient Greek sitos for food and topos for place. I believe we already live in Sitopia. We live in a world shaped by food, and that if we realize that, we can use food as a really powerful tool, conceptual tool, design tool, to shape the world differently. So if we were to do that, what might Sitopia look like? Well, I think it looks a bit like this. I have to use this slide, it's just the look on the face of the dog. But anyway, it's food at the centre of life, at the centre of family life, being celebrated, being enjoyed, people taking time for it. This is where food should be in our society. But you can't have scenes like this unless you have people like this. By the way, these can be men as well. It's people who think about food, who think ahead, who plan, who can stare at a pile of raw vegetables and actually recognise them. We need these people. They're part of a network. Because without these kinds of people, we can't have places like this. Here, I deliberately chose this because it is a man buying a vegetable. But networks, markets where food's been grown locally, it's come in, it's fresh, it's part of the social life of the city. Because without that, you can't have this kind of place, food that's grown locally and also is part of the landscape and is not just a zero-sum commodity off in some unseen hellhole. Cows with a view. Steaming piles of hummus, this is basically bringing the whole thing together. And this is a community project I visited recently in Toronto. It's a greenhouse where kids get told all about food and growing their own food. Here's a plant called Kevin, or maybe it's a plant belonging to a kid called Kevin, I don't know. But anyway, these kinds of projects that are trying to reconnect us with nature is extremely important. So Sitopia for me is really a way of seeing. It's basically recognizing that Sitopia already exists in little pockets everywhere. The trick is to join them up, to use food as a way of seeing. And if we do that, we're going to stop seeing cities as big, metropolitan, unproductive blobs like this. We're going to see them more like this, as part of the productive, organic framework of which they are inevitably a part, symbiotically connected. But of course, that's not a great image either, because we need not to be producing food like this anymore. We need to be thinking more about permaculture, which is why I think this image just sums up for me the kind of thinking we need to be doing. It's a reconceptualization of the way food shapes our lives. The best image I know of this is from 650 years ago. It's Ambrogio Lorenzetti's allegory of good government. It's about the relationship between the city and the countryside. And I think the message of this is very clear. If the city looks after the country will look after the city. And I want us to ask now, what would Ambrogio Lorenzetti paint if he painted this image today? What would an allegory of good government look like today? Because I think it's an urgent question. It's one we have to ask, and we have to start answering. We know we are what we eat. We need to realize that the world is also what we eat, but if we take that idea, we can use food as a really powerful tool to shape the world better. Thank you very much.
这个建筑教授他所讲的事情是听起来很轻松，但是是一个非常重要的问题，也就是民以食为天。我们如何处理饮食的问题，也就是我们的粮食，从哪里来？那它的来源的重还是来源的轻，以及我们消耗粮食是重是轻，都会影响到我们的饮食文化。那我们现在大概从这个比较先进的国家知道，我们已经吃的太多了。那但是要改变这个整个生产的过程，刚刚各位都听到他讲的，我们大概问3个问题，那我们就下课休息一下，先来看看哪一位要分享。我们饮食文化，如果照刚刚的这一位Steele 教授他说，我们应该要设法变成不是 utopia， 而是 Citopia。Citopia 就是以这个粮食为主的都市。你觉得有什么样子的想法可行？你几年级？1年级。1年级，念什么？建筑。好，试试看。
为什么呢？是粮食的转变吗？
这样子，你住哪里？
台中。
你家住台中？那你家在台中，你知道你吃的米从哪里来吗？
不知道。
你知道你吃的肉从哪里来吗？厨房。好，那你试试看，想象一下你现在吃的这些食物，大概是从哪里来？
屠宰场吧。
屠宰场在哪里？
在台湾的某个地方。
离你远还是近？
远吧。如果是牛肉的话，应该就是美国，不然纽西兰。
哦。美国不是有那个吗？
对啊。可是台湾还是有进的。
哦，那你敢吃？
不是很敢。
OK， 那蔬菜呢？蔬菜从哪里来？
云林吧。
云林。OK， 那你有没有办法？你家住在台中的哪里？
台中市科博馆附近。
OK， 你有没有想象说，假设它就在科博馆，你走路10分钟可以到的范围，有一个农场，它可以种蔬菜，你每天可以走过去就是买新鲜的蔬菜。
太可能了。
不啊，那如果有一个人告诉你说他想这样做，你会帮他想出什么 idea 可以这样做？屋顶可以利用在中间来种蔬菜之类的。就是家里的屋顶呢？
对。
OK， 好。你也是1年级吗？
对。我觉得如果有一个人有这样的想法的话，我应该会先考虑就是种的那个量，因为如果很多人要吃的话，那表示那地方很大，可是城市里面好像没有那种地方可以让它这样，所以我觉得可能会其他多考虑。
考虑什么？
考虑那块地的大小的问题。
你意思是你叫他放弃？
叫他可以多想一点。
好，客气的时候叫他放弃。你呢？
种在房子周围，就是
你现在住哪里？
新竹。
新竹，你家的周围可以种菜吗？
没有，可是可以，就是跟着那个绿化一起，就不会影响到，不会有太多影响。比如说中间的那个人行道，就是汽车道，不是有那个种树嘛，可以变成种菜啊，对啊。
你有没有种过菜？
没有。
有没有看过人家种菜？
我外婆。
你外婆种菜？
她是在，就是城市的，也是在城市里面，可能是没有开发的地上，对。
要不要防虫？
还是要。
所以要不要有太阳？
要有水。
要有水，要有太阳，要
防虫，
对不对？那也不是好像随便找个地方可以种，对不对？
对啊，但可以潜水利之类的，就是比如说地下水道，或是阳光道。
OK， 好，还有谁分享？你呢？你也是1年级吗？你几年级？
大4。
大4，读
工业设计。
工业设计，好，那你来想个办法。
它是用就河跟河堤的地方，有些小河旁边可能还是泥土，然后那边有光，然后旁边就有水，会有比较大的面积可以种。
是意思说把河堤变成菜圃 ，OK？ 有没有比较不一样的想法呢？
之前外国有一个新闻说，他把菜种在卡车，然后就是根据你就可以根据你居住的地方，然后就是四处移动农产。所以如果你想要买菜的话，我们就把卡车开到你家附近，然后你就马上可以上车来在那边期间蔬菜。所以这是一个解决方法。那如果我想说，如果不一定就是这样子就可以解脱，就是我们在城市中土地的束缚。那如果现在就是结合像什么城际青梅，那是就是垂直的种植的话，我觉得建筑也是有很多的额外的空间可以种植蔬菜，所以也是一个不错的方法。
好，还有别的想法了吗？没有，你有吗？
就是现代的城市啊，它的主要目的是追求就是现在人最想要的一个东西，就是金钱嘛。然后，但如果之后我们的食物变成到达我们追求那个地位的时候，人们对这个看法就会不一样。就可能整个城市都是为了生产蔬菜而成为一个城市，而不是为了就是赚钱成为一个城市。
哦，乌托邦吗？
还不错。
好。